functions. If you've been following our tutorial series, you may have discovered that at some point we've talked about functions. At some point uh, we've implemented functions in our program, although we didn't really speak exclusively about functions. So I thought, okay, let's dedicate a tutorial for functions. In JavaScript, functions are used to structure programs. Okay, so functions allow us to manage our program more effectively, especially if you have some kind of code in your program where you tend to reuse that code maybe in more than a place in your program. So in order for you not to repeat yourself, you can just extract that program and then wrap that program around a function. Say you have a website, for instance, and then say there is a program that sends email to your users. Say in different sections of your website, you send in emails to your users, maybe for email activation. Maybe your users, they're trying to like send you contact message, or maybe they're doing one or two things. The other things they doing on your website or anything like that where you need to send emails. So you can just take that code and extract it into a function, and then all you have to do is when you get to that part in your program where you need to send an email, you can just invoke that function and then pass the argument as required. Okay, so we're going to begin by by getting into the semantics of functions. Okay. In terms of semantics, in terms of how functions behave in their lexical scope, we have two types of functions. We have okay, let me open Visual Studio Code. See, I've added an image. I've added an image to our index.html file. That's the image displayed in our browser. We have what is known as function statement or function declaration. So if we're doing function declaration in JavaScript, usually we start with the keyword function. Okay, and then the function name, let's say greet, and then a pair of parentheses, and then curly braces. So this is how we declare function. So this is also known as function statement. So there's function declaration, otherwise known as function statement, and then there is function expression. So this is function statement. It's so easy to confuse both. I mean, at some point in our tutorial, I may have blundered as well, like misusing these words. If it turned out that I had blundered along the way, please forgive me. Okay, so this is function declaration, otherwise known as a function statement. So it begins with a function keyword, and then we have the function name. So in this case, the function name is greet. we have a pair of parentheses and then curly braces. Okay, if we're passing a parameter inside this function, the parameter stays inside this pair of parentheses. But say we're not passing the parameter, so we just say, okay, console.log hi or hello. Okay. At this point, this function does nothing. Okay. So in order to use this function, we have to invoke it. So the way we invoke a function is to write the name of the function followed by a pair of parentheses. So if we save this, we log, let me open the console. We have hello in our browser, okay, in our console. So this is function declaration. There's another way we could have written this. I could have done something like, what is it now? I could have done let's greet equals, so this is known as function expression. So this is anonymous function expression. I assign it, I'm assigning this function to a variable greet, okay? And here in this function, I do not have a name like the previous syntax. So this is anonymous function declaration, okay? So greet is now the variable name. So if I save this, we should still get the same thing as before. We have hello, okay? Good. Now, you may have been hearing about side effects. And what are side effects? So it turns out that the primary effect of a function is to return a value. That's the primary effect of a function, to return a value. But then there are times when a function, it's not explicitly returning a value. So you have a situation where the function is modifying the state outside of its scope. Okay? So in that case, what you have is the function has a side effect. That side effect occurs when a function is modifying the state. It's modifying the state or the value of a variable, a function, an object, whatever the case, outside of its own logical scope. That's when you have side effects. Okay? Now, when a function performs its own primary effect, that is, it exclusively or explicitly returns a value, that's when we say we have a pure function. So the difference between a side effect and a primary effect, or the difference between a side effect function and a pure function, is pure functions, they return a value. Functions that are side effects, they modify states outside of their scope. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Let me give you an example of what I'm trying to convey to you. If I have let num is equals to 5, okay, and then here I say function get num, okay, then inside here I say num plus plus, and then I say console.log num. Let's see what we get. Oh, sorry, I didn't call the function. I didn't invoke the function. Let me invoke the function here. So now get num. Okay, so let's see what we get. We get 6. Let's go back to the program. Say I've declared this variable num to be 5. Now I have this function. This function is modifying this variable. This variable is in a global scope. See, it's outside of this function. Now I am incrementing this variable. That is, I'm modifying the state of this variable inside of this function. Not only that, I am logging that value to the console. So this type of function has side effects. As you can see, it's modifying the value of a variable that is outside of its scope. Okay? So this function has side effects. Although I'm using the keyword function here. When you have function declaration with this keyword, JavaScript sort of like hoists this to the top of the scope. I may have mentioned this along the line, like in the course of our series, I may have mentioned this to you. But what I'm trying to get across to you right now is when you have a function that is modifying the state outside of its lexical scope, then we say, okay, this function has side effects. It doesn't matter if we didn't even try to modify this. Say this is what we have inside of this function. This function is still going to have side effects. The reason why it's going to have side effects is because, well, we're using the console.log function. This console.log function, it's another function that is not exclusive. It's not exclusive to this getNum function. This function is invoking another function inside of it. So in a way, it's using this console.log function to log some kind of information to the console. So this is the side effects. Okay? Now, if we have a pure function, this is an example of a pure function. Function greet. Okay? And then here I say return hello. Hello. Okay? And then I can invoke this function here. I can do greet. Okay, this is not going to work as we need to log this to the console. Okay. Now, this is an example of a pure function. Pure in the sense that, well, this function is doing its primary effect, which is to return the value. So it's returning a string, hello. And the thing about a function with return statement is after this function returns, this function is done. It has completed its work. Okay? It's completed its job. That's it. So once it's returned a value, it's done. So this is an example of a pure function. If we go here, we should say hello. It works. Okay? Now, this is not to say that functions that have side effects, they're necessarily bad. No, they're not. Depending on how complicated your program is or how robust whatever you're doing, at some point you're going to have functions that have side effects. They're modifying some kind of state outside of their scope. The more important thing is you know what you're doing so that you don't run into unintentional side effects. In any case, it doesn't really make much sense to have too many functions that have side effects in your program. Okay? So that's that. Let me go back. Let's talk about this thing known as hoisting. I'm going to stay here. Okay? So when we use keyword function to declare a function like this, JavaScript hoists this function to the top of the scope. And because of that, we are allowed to do this. Check this out. Check this out. We're still getting hello. Even though this function was declared below this console.log statement, we are still able to access the value. Okay? So I think this is one of the the merits of using function declaration. If I go to function expression, for instance, if I did const greet and I do function, okay, this is what I get, okay, and then I do this. Let's see what we get. We get uncaught reference error, cannot access grid before initialization. So I don't know if you're beginning to see the difference between both. In function declaration, our function is hoisted to the top of the scope. In function expression, okay, yeah, in function expression, our function is not hoisted to the top of the scope. So it's important you understand what is happening here. Okay? All right. Let's talk about arguments, passing argument and parameters to functions. All right. If I go back to Visual Studio Code, we've talked about hoisting. Okay. Let me go here. I'm still going to do function greets or CI. I don't know what. What should I do now? Greet. Okay. So here I can say return greets. Okay. We're doing JavaScript, so we don't even know what type of what type of data is greet at this point. So we're doing TypeScript, for instance. We could have specified the type of data this greet is, even specify the type of return value that say hi is supposed to return. But in any case, JavaScript is dynamically typed, so we have this we have the latitude to do this. So we have this function say hi. It's taking a parameter greet. You can think of a parameter as an input, okay, an input that a function takes. So at this point, we don't know what greet is. So if I come here and I do console.log say hi, let's see what we get. Undefined. Okay. Now the reason we're getting undefined is because this function takes an input greet. Okay, but we've not specified what that input is here. So that's why we're getting undefined. So if I wish to pass an argument, okay, so there's a difference now. When a function takes an input, it's called parameter. At the point where we're invoking it, when we specify the value of that input, that is known as arguments. Okay? So here, if I do hi, so now I have assigned value to the parameter greets. So let's go here. We get hi. Good. If I didn't say hi, who knows? If I did 5, we should still get 5, right? Because JavaScript is dynamically typed, so we're not specifying the return value of this function. Okay, so that is how we pass inputs into function. Okay, I could also do for function statements. I can do const greet equals function. Then let's say in here I'm saying name. Nope. Okay, I'll do this, and I can say return return hello. Should I use okay, let me use template string, or I can still do this. Hello, let me concatenate name like that. We've talked about this before. So I will concatenate adding two variables, two strings, so to speak. Um, so this is a function expression. It's taking a parameter name. So if I come here, I can do console.log. So this greet variable, I'm going to invoke it like we invoke a function. And then inside here, maybe I want to pass hola. And then this should log hello hola to the console. Hello hola. Okay? So that works for us. Okay? I don't want to use too complicated example. Let's move on. Okay, we have default arguments. But before I speak of default arguments, perhaps let me write one more function. This may look a bit complicated. Let's do function power. Okay, let's say I'm trying to write a function for calculating what is it called, the exponent of a number. So we're going to have a base, we're going to have an exponent, okay, and then here we can initialize our result, set our result to 1, and here we can loop for let count equals to 0, count less than exponent. Then we have count plus plus. Okay, and here we can set our result. Multiplication assignment with our base. Okay, and then afterwards we can return our result here. Okay, so here I can do console.log power. Oh, sorry guys, power. So let's do 2 raised to the power 6. Let's see what we get. So we get 64. Okay. Now there's something known as default arguments. If you look at here, we have parameters. Okay, we have parameters. 2 parameters, base and exponents. And then we are assigning values to those parameters here at the point of the function invocation. Okay, now I could do default parameter, or if you like default argument. I can set this to 4, for instance. Okay, if I set this to 4 and then I save this as it is, this still works. We still get 64. Now, the reason I'm setting this default argument here is in the event that I decide to omit the second argument here, say I do not wish to specify another value for exponent here, then the second argument here will just default to this. So if I cancel this and I just pass 2, then it works. We have 16. So that's 2 raised to the power 4, which is 16. Okay? Get that? If I set this to, let's say, 3, okay? And then I come here, let's see what happens. I have 2 here, which means I'm overriding this 3. So this should be 2 raised to the power 4, Let's see what we get. We get 16. Good. If I didn't pass anything here, let's see what we get. We get 81. So that is 3 raised to power 4. Okay? So I hope you guys, you understanding how the fourth argument, how it works. Okay? We also have this thing known as a arrow function. Okay? Say you want to get something done very quickly. You could have, who knows, let's say const square. This is arrow function syntax. You have a parenthesis and then you have an arrow. Okay? If we pass, okay, if I do 2 multiply by 2, let's see what we get. Okay, I have to log this. Console.log square. I think I have to invoke it as well. Let's see what we get. I get 4. Okay? You see that this syntax is more concise than the other ones. Okay? We didn't even have to use return statement here. But this arrow symbol, in this context, it means return. So that's why we didn't have to use return here. If we had done this, I think we would have needed return, because we could have done this as I think we could have done return 2 multiplied by 2. Let's see what we get. We still get 4. So with the introduction of the curly braces, I have to use return. If I just did this, I don't think it will work. And even if it works, it's bad problem. See, I get undefined. So when you're using curly braces, you need your return statement. Okay? You need your return statement. If you omit the curly braces, you don't need return statements. Okay? Okay. Arrow statement can also take parameters. Okay. If we're passing, say we're passing num, a parameter here. Okay. And here we can say num multiply by num. All right. So here we have to specify what num is. So if we do 4 here, we get 16. Okay. Now, because inside here, our parameter is just 1. We have the leverage of omitting this parenthesis because it's just 1, which makes the syntax even shorter. So if we save this, we still get 16. Okay, that's our function. Okay. Okay. Let me stop there. I don't want to complicate this because this is targeting beginners. So this is arrow function. Okay. Let's talk about closure. Yeah, let's talk about closure. When we have closure, what is really going on in closure? A closure, it allows an inner function to access the scope of an outer function. So even after the outer function has finished executing, the inner function is still closing around the outer function. Okay? I want to use an example that is not so complicated. So if we have function counter, for instance, okay, counter, okay, and then here we say let count equals to 1, okay, and then we say return a function, okay, and we say console.log count. I might even say count plus plus. Let's see. Okay, and then here I can say const result is equals to what's that? Counter. Okay, counter. All right. Now, at this point, counter has been invoked. This counter function is returning another function. It's an anonymous function. And that function is logging the incremental value of counts to the console. Okay? Now, I'm evoking this counter here. I'm assigning it to this variable counts. Okay? At this point, the outer function has finished its execution. But this internal anonymous function, it still remembers the scope of this outer function. And because it still remembers the scope of this outer function, I'm able to do this console.log results. Let's see what we get. I hope this works. I get 1. Okay, where I'm getting undefined here because where I'm using console. Okay, what's that? Okay, this is plus plus. Coming. That's not working. Okay, I get 1. All right. So this undefined is because of this console.log, because this function is not explicitly returning the value. It's logging this to the console. So what is it called? Your console.log statement is not supposed to generate a value that you can use across your program. So at the point where I'm evoking this, it's log this variable to the console, and it's okay, there's no other value I can give you. So it's telling me undefined. So you don't need to worry about that. Okay, so what I'm trying to get across here is this. We have an outer function counter. We set a variable count inside here, okay, to 1. And then we're returning this anonymous function, which is logging the value of count to the console. And then I'm invoking this counter here, setting it to this variable results. At this point, this counter function has finished executing. But it turns out that our inner anonymous function still remembers, it still has access to this outer function. So we're able to call this function here. So I'm saying console.log result. All right? If I do this, it shouldn't work. You see, it shouldn't work. So if I go do this again, it works. So it looks like, if you can see it, like we are evoking this function twice. The first time here, and then the second time here. So this function remembers, it still closes around the value of the outer function, if that makes sense. Okay. Another usage of closure is we use closure to assign or to define private variable. Okay, and I'm going to demonstrate that now. I'm still going to stick to our counter function. I'm coming. Let me take this away. Okay, so I have let count equals 1. Say I chose to return an object inside here. Of course, objects do have properties, all right? So inside here, if I do increment, that's my key, and then I have a function, okay? So I'm saying increment, which means I have to increment our count, and then I have to return it, return count, all right? That's the first property. Let me use the second property as decrement, okay? I also give the value as function, okay? Then to decrement our variable, I have this, and then I return count, okay? Say I set the third property, so I do that as a reset. I also set it to function, that's the value. Then I can do return count equals to 0. Okay? Now pay attention to what we're doing here. We have our counter function. Inside our counter function, we have a variable count. We set it to 1. And then we're returning an object. Okay? A JavaScript object. Objects have properties. Properties are key value pairs. So for our first property, the key is increment, and then the value is this function. So we're incrementing count inside of this function, and then we're returning it. The second property is decrement. The value is function. We're decrementing it, returning it, and then we're resetting count. I'm resetting count, say return count equals to 0. I think I should just do this. No, if I do this to 0, and now return count equals to 0. No, hold on. If I do this, does it work? Okay, we'll see. And then here, pay attention to what I'm going to do. I can do const in. I don't want to use the same word. Increase. Then I can do counter. Okay, counter dot increment. Okay, counter dot increment. This is me calling the value of the first property. All right, I'm calling the value of the first property. Or perhaps let me do this. Let me use the short syntax. So instead of doing this, let me just do console.log. Aha, can do this. And pass it inside this. Okay, so that is me. I'm trying to get the value of before I start replicating this. Let me see whether this works. I'm not sure of the syntax. Counter or increment is not a function, so obviously I'm doing something wrong. What am I doing wrong? Counter dot increment. Okay, if I set this, const increase. Okay, I think the issue is I have to evoke, what is it called? I have to invoke the counter before I'm able to access its properties. So I can do const result. Okay, no. Let me see my counter. No, result. Let me use result. Result equals counter. So I've invoked it now. And then I can access the properties. So I can do console.log result dot increment. This we're in closure. Don't forget we said the function will remember its outer scope. Okay, then we do console.log result dot decrement. Okay, and then we do console.log result dot reset. Okay, and then let me do one more, console.log result dot count. Count is a variable, it's not a function, so we don't need a parenthesis there. Let's see what we get. Okay, for the first one we got 1, the second one we got 0, the third one we got 0, the fourth one we got undefined. All right, that's working as expected. Let's go back to our code. So we have this counter function. We are trying to explain the idea of a closure. We say closure is when an inner function is able to, what is it called? It's able to access the scope of an outer function even after the outer function has finished executing. Okay, so the inner function still remembers. Okay, so here we have our counter. We set a private variable a count, we set it to 0, and then we're returning an object. This object has 3 properties. Each of the property is pointing to a function. Okay, and this each of the function is, this is incrementing the variable and returning it. This is decrementing variable, returning it. This is resetting it to where we started. Okay, so here we have count set to 0. When we increment it in the first instance, that should be 1, and then we're returning it. When we decrement it, it goes back to 0. When we reset it, we return in count, which is 0. Okay, so here we're getting 1, 0, 0. Hope that makes sense. Okay, now when we come here, this is how we invoke this function. First, we invoke this counter function. Okay, that's the outer function. So we have like 4 functions here now, 3 inner functions, okay, and then 1 outer function, and 3 of them remember the scope of this outer function, even after the function has finished executing here. So we've invoked it here, we set it here, okay? So at this point, this outer function has finished executing, but then we're still able to call these inner functions by using the variable assigned to this outer function, and then we're doing increment, okay? So my linter is messing this thing up. So you have result of increment, that's for the first inner function. Result of decrement, that's for the second inner function. Result of reset, that's for the third inner function. Okay, this is for the variable. Now, this is what I'm trying to convey to you. Because we're using closure, this variable is private to this function. So we are unable to access it. So another usage of closure is to define private variable. You see, even though result is pointing to this function, you would expect that we should be able to access this variable. But it turns out this variable is private to this function. We cannot access it outside of it. It was why when we did result.count here, we got undefined. Okay? Well, how would that make sense? Okay. Let's move on. Let's talk about recursion. Recursion is when a function recalls it, when a function calls itself inside that function body. Okay, that's an example. That's how recursion works. Okay, I'm going to start with what is it called? I'm going to start with our function power. We've done this before, right? We've done this before. So I think I should just use this to explain recursion. Then we have base. Then we have exponents. Okay. Yeah, so this is a function. Okay. Don't forget what we said about this. We said we're trying to get the exponent of a value or whatever value. Okay. So if you have a number raised to the power of 0, that's 1, right? So here we can say if exponent is equals to 0, return 1. All right? Else return, so we start with our base, return base. Now this is where the recursion comes in. Multiply by power. Okay, then we have base, then exponent minus 1. Okay, now let's see what we get. Const result equals to power. Okay, let's use two simple numbers, 2 is power 5. Okay, now let's do console.log result. Let's see what we get. Oh, result is not a function. What did I do wrong? I think this is the issue. Sorry. We get 32. All right. So this is an example of recursion. 2 raised to the power 5 is 32, obviously. If we do 2 raised to the power 6, that should be 64. Okay. So this is how recursion works. You have a function, and inside that function body, you are invoking that function so that that function is recalling itself prior to us evoking it. Okay. If this didn't make sense, I'm going to do another one, which is, I think it should be familiar to you. Let me just, if you have function factorial, everybody knows about factorial. Factorial, it takes a number, abi? Okay, so here we can say if n is 0, for instance, we know 0 factorial is 1, right? So if you say if n is less than or equals to 0, then you can say return 1. Okay, and then else we can say return, what should we do now? Return factorial n minus 1 multiply by n. I believe everybody is familiar with this because, yeah, 2 factorial is 2 multiplied by 2 minus 1 factorial. So this is it, right? So this is by n factorial. That's n multiplied by n minus 1 factorial. So, okay, so if you do 3 factorial, that's 3 multiplied by 3 minus, what is it called now? Is it 1 factorial? And then you can just expand it like that. So here, if we say console.log factorial, let's pass 5. Let's see what we get. 120. So 5 factorial is 120, right? If I pass 0 here, I should get 1, because I've specified here. That's 1. Okay? So that's recursion. Okay? I want to talk about this JavaScript function known as immediately invoked function expression. Okay, it's not this function is not it's not as common as it used to be anymore, because I think the problem that uh, they were designed to solve in terms of how they behave across a scope, the let and const keyword have sort of like sorted those issues out. So we don't really use what is it called, immediately invoke function expression like before. Okay, so I'm going to let me give some examples. I'm just going to give some simple examples there. So this is how we invoke. This is how we uh, define. What I'm saying is this IIFE, immediately invoked function expression. So it's a function that evokes itself. So this is the syntax. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Okay, so and then here I can do function. Then I can do something inside of here. That's it. So if I do, what is it called? If I do console.log hi, let's see what we get. We get hi. See? That works. No sweat. It can also, what is it called? We can also pass parameter here as we like, but then if we pass parameter here as we like, we're going to have to specify, because it's immediately invoked. It's not, what is it called? You're not going to like declare this function, and then you come out and then you want to say, no. You don't do that like that. So say you want to like set a private variable, for instance, and then you do let greet, no, that's not great, const greet is equals to hello, in this case, then you can say console.greet here. Okay, and then if you go here, you get hello. If you come outside of this function to do console.log greet, you can't access it because greet is local to this function. You can't access it outside. You see, uncut reference error, greet is not defined. Okay, so we use what is it called? We use immediately invoked function execution when we, this example, when we use it for defining private variable, and also we use it when we wish to write a code that we want the code to execute immediately after creation. Okay, you're not going to be using this a lot, so I'm not going to be dwelling too long on immediately invoke function execution. If you don't know what I'm talking about, this is what I'm talking about. Immediately invoke function expression. Okay, that's IIFE. Okay, so that's an example of IIFE. We can also do our IIFE in terms of an arrow function. So you would do something like this. I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself. And then here, then you can say console.log hello. And then this should still work. So this is arrow function inside what is it called? Immediately evoke function expression. So if I save this, I should still get hello. See? Hello. Okay. Now, let's talk about, I don't know, maybe we're going to have another tutorial for asynchronous programming. But I just want to give an example of an asynchronous function. Okay? Um, an asynchronous function has this keyword known as async. So you have async, then you have your function, and then you have a function name. Okay, say you're trying to fetch data from a source, for instance. And say you can do this as fetch data. All right. So we are in the browser. There is an API in the browser that is available for us to fetch data. Those of you who are used to, if you have experience working with Ajax, then you know you're familiar with this syntax. So let's say we're trying to fetch data from a URL. So I'm going to pass an input here, URL. I don't know, maybe from a web server somewhere, www.http, whatever it is. And then here I can do const response. So this is a response we should get if we're able to fetch what we're trying to fetch. Okay, now because we've used async here, before I'm able to evoke another method here, I'm going to use another keyword, which is await. Now this is asynchronous programming. We do asynchronous programming. Asynchronous programming is non-blocking because I think JavaScript is multi-threaded or so. So when you're trying to fetch data from a server, for instance, because things can go wrong, maybe the network is bad or something like that. So we're doing asynchronous programming so that at that point when you're trying to fetch the data from the server, your code is not blocking the other code from executing. So you can see this word awaits. Okay? I'm not going to do it too long on this. So now we can use our fetch API. Sorry. So this fetch API is from our browser. Okay? And then here we can do pass our URL there. Okay? And then we can do const data. So this, whatever response we get is going to be stored here. Okay? So this data is just me trying to access whatever response was fetched from this URL. This URL could have been anything. Okay? So when it const data equals await response .json. Okay? So what we're doing now is we're transforming our response. We're trying to represent it in JSON format. So JSON is binary, what is it called? A data representation, key value pairs, okay? And then here we can return data. This is just for demonstration. It's not going to do anything because we've not even specified the URL. Okay? So this is supposed to be a live URL, something like that. I don't want to do it too long on this because I think I'm planning on making an asynchronous, a tutorial on asynchronous programming. But I hope you get the idea. So this is an example of async functions. So you use the keyword async. You have your function, the name of the function. Then if it's taking an argument, if it's taking a parameter, you set the parameter. So this function is fetching something from, what is it called? From a server. So this fetch API is, it's a method that our browser gives us to fetch whatever we're trying to fetch from a server somewhere. So this is on the client, so usually you can just pass this inside your script tag or we're in the script tag already. So whatever is returned We can try to access it with this data, and then is it serialize it now? Now we represent it in JSON format, okay? And then we return the data, okay? When we get into asynchronous programming proper, then I'm going to show you a live URL and how this can fetch something from the server, and then we can display it, and you're going to see how this JSON format also works, okay? I hope you've learned something in the course of this tutorial. I'm going to see you guys next time. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.